My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 23, I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like. I was wrong. Rock bottom was standing in my childhood driveway at midnight, clutching a garbage bag of hastily packed clothes, while my mother screamed from the doorway that I was an embarrassment to the family name. Rock bottom was watching my father turn his back and walk inside without a word. But what happened next would reveal a family secret that had been hidden for decades and change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and what it really means to come home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The events that led to that devastating night began 3 months earlier, though the seeds had been planted years before. I'd always been different from what my parents expected. While my younger brother Marcus excelled at soccer and brought home report cards that made Mom beam with pride, I spent my time volunteering at the animal shelter and writing poetry that no one in my family understood. Where Marcus was outgoing and charming, I was introspective and passionate about causes that seemed to irritate my parents. My mother, Carmen Rodriguez, was a woman who measured success by neighborhood gossip and social media likes. She worked as a receptionist at a high-end dental practice and had cultivated an image of perfection that required constant maintenance. Every family photo was staged, every holiday was performed for an audience of relatives and neighbors who she believed were always watching, always judging. My father, Roberto, owned a small construction company and shared Mom's obsession with appearances, though his version focused more on traditional gender roles and what he called practical success. The trouble started when I made a decision that, in retrospect, was both the best and worst choice of my young adult life. I'd been working part-time at a veterinary clinic while finishing my degree in social work, and one rainy Tuesday, everything changed. Dr. Martinez brought in a case that would haunt me for weeks afterward. A family had surrendered their elderly dog, claiming they couldn't afford his medical care anymore. The dog, a gentle golden retriever named Buddy, had diabetes and needed daily insulin shots. The family wanted him euthanized rather than pay for his treatment. I couldn't sleep that night. Buddy's trusting brown eyes kept appearing in my mind, and by morning, I'd made a decision that would set everything in motion. I used my savings, all $3,000 I'd been setting aside for a deposit on my own apartment, to pay for Buddy's medical bills and adoption fee. I brought him home that afternoon, knowing my parents would be furious, but believing that surely, once they met him, they'd understand. I was spectacularly wrong. Mom took one look at Buddy, with his graying muzzle and the slight tremor in his hind legs, and immediately began calculating the financial burden. "Elena, this is ridiculous," she said, not even bothering to pet him. "This dog is ancient. How much did you spend on this mistake?" When I told her about the $3,000, her face went white, then red, then a shade of purple I'd never seen before. Dad's reaction was worse. He didn't yell, which somehow made it more devastating. He just stared at me with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief that cut deeper than any harsh words could have. "You threw away your future for a dying dog," he said quietly. "Your apartment fund, your independence, all of it. For what? So you can play hero to an animal that strangers didn't even want?" The next few weeks were tense, but I thought we could work through it. Buddy was actually an amazing companion. Despite his age and health issues, he had a gentle wisdom that seemed to calm everyone around him. He never barked unnecessarily, never chewed furniture, and had an uncanny ability to sense when someone needed comfort. Marcus surprisingly took to him immediately, often doing his homework with Buddy's head resting on his feet. But my parents remained unmoved. Every insulin shot I gave Buddy in the morning became a source of tension. Every vet bill, even routine ones, sparked arguments about fiscal responsibility and priorities. Mom started making pointed comments about how the neighbors were probably talking about that Rodriguez girl who went broke for a stray dog. Dad began leaving articles about fiscal responsibility on my desk, highlighted in yellow marker. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. I'd just gotten acceptance into a master's program for social work, with a partial scholarship that would allow me to specialize in animal-assisted therapy. It was everything I'd worked toward, a chance to combine my passion for helping people with my love for animals. I was so excited that I rushed home to share the news, still clutching the acceptance letter. Mom was in the kitchen preparing for one of her dinner parties, the kind where she invited the neighbors over to showcase our perfect family. She barely glanced at the letter when I showed it to her, more focused on arranging appetizers on her best serving platter. "That's nice, mija," she said absently. "Can you put Buddy in the garage before people arrive? Mrs. Chen is coming, and you know how she feels about pet hair." The casual dismissal stung, but it was Dad's reaction that truly hurt. He read the entire letter, including the scholarship details, then handed it back with a sigh. "Elena, this is exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "Animal therapy? You're going to accumulate more debt to play with pets for a living? When are you going to make choices that actually build a future?" That night's dinner party became a nightmare I still replay in my mind during sleepless nights. Mom had invited the Chens, the Garcias, and the Morales family, all neighbors whose opinion she valued above almost everything else. The conversation flowed in Spanish and English, jumping between topics like neighborhood gossip, children's achievements, and community news. I'd been relegated to kitchen duty, bringing out food and clearing plates while the adults talked. Everything was going smoothly until Mrs. Garcia asked about my future plans. Mom immediately brightened, probably planning to discuss Marcus's latest soccer achievements or Dad's business success. But Mrs. Garcia was looking directly at me. "Elena, your mother tells me you're finishing university soon. What are your plans?" I should have deflected, should have given a vague answer about still deciding. Instead, I found myself explaining my acceptance into the master's program, my passion for animal-assisted therapy, and my dream of opening a practice that would help trauma survivors through interaction with rescue animals. As I spoke, I could see my parents, expressions growing more strained, but I couldn't stop myself. For the first time in months, adults were listening to me, actually interested in what I had to say. Mr. Chen leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "That sounds fascinating, Elena. I've read about therapy animals helping veterans with PTSD. Is that the kind of work you want to do?" I nodded enthusiastically, explaining some of the research I'd been reading, the success stories I'd encountered during my volunteer work. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with the guests asking thoughtful questions about my studies, my volunteer work at the animal shelter, and my plans for the future. For a brief, shining moment, I felt seen and valued by the adults in my community. Then Buddy wandered in from the garage. I'd forgotten to latch the door properly, and he'd managed to push it open. He didn't cause any trouble, just padded quietly into the living room and settled beside my chair, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. But Mom's reaction was immediate and devastating. "Elena," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Get that animal out of here immediately! I specifically told you to keep him contained." Her embarrassment was palpable, radiating from her in waves that—
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Seemed to fill the entire room. The guests fell silent, the warm atmosphere evaporating instantly. I started to get up, to gently lead Buddy back to the garage, but Mrs. Garcia surprised everyone by kneeling down to pet him. "Oh, what a sweet old boy," she said warmly. "My mother had a dog just like this when I was growing up. They have such gentle souls, don't they?" Instead of being reassured by the guest's positive reaction, Mom's embarrassment seemed to intensify. "I'm so sorry," she said, shooting me a look that promised retribution later. "Elena has this obsession with rescuing broken things. We keep telling her it's not practical, but she doesn't listen." The words hit me like a physical blow. Broken things. That's how she saw Buddy, how she saw my compassion, how she saw me. I stood frozen, holding Buddy's collar, while the room fell into an uncomfortable silence that stretched on for what felt like hours. Mr. Morales, trying to lighten the mood, chuckled awkwardly. "Well, we all have our phases, right? I'm sure Elena will grow out of this animal thing and focus on something more sensible." "We certainly hope so," Dad added, his voice carrying a finality that made my stomach drop. She's wasted enough time and money on this already. I left the room then, leading Buddy back to the garage, but I could hear the conversation continuing behind me. Mom's voice, apologetic and strained, explaining how worried they were about my impractical choices and lack of direction. Dad chiming in with concerns about my financial decisions and my inability to focus on realistic goals. The guests offering well-meaning but painful advice about tough love and the importance of children learning from their mistakes. By the time the last guest left, I'd retreated to my room with Buddy, both of us sensing the storm that was coming. I could hear my parents talking in the kitchen, their voices low but intense. Words like embarrassing and irresponsible drifted up through the floorboards, along with phrases I'd heard too many times before. What will people think? And, she's making us look like fools. The confrontation came the next morning over breakfast. Marcus had already left for school, so it was just the three of us around the kitchen table that had witnessed thousands of family meals, homework sessions, and conversations about everything from politics to weekend plans. But this morning felt different, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl. Mom started first, her voice deceptively calm. "Elena, your father and I have been talking about last night. About your behavior and your choices." She paused, arranging her words carefully. "We think it's time for some changes." I knew where this was heading, but I still held on to hope that they might surprise me. "What kind of changes?" Dad leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're 23 years old, Elena. You're an adult, and it's time you started acting like one. These rescue projects, this unrealistic career path, this constant need to embarrass us in front of our friends and neighbors, it has to stop." "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone," I said quietly. Mrs. Garcia seemed genuinely interested in my work. Mr. Chen asked thoughtful questions. I was just answering honestly. "You were showing off," Mom corrected, "making us look like we raised a daughter who has no common sense, no practical thinking. Do you know what Mrs. Chen said to me after you left the room? She said she felt sorry for us having to deal with a daughter who throws money away on hopeless causes." The words stung, but something in Mom's tone made me suspect she was exaggerating, if not outright lying. Mrs. Chen had seemed genuinely supportive of my goals, even asking for my contact information so she could connect me with her nephew who worked with therapy animals. But I'd learned long ago that challenging my parents' version of events only made things worse. "What do you want from me?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Dad pulled out a sheet of paper, obviously prepared for this conversation. "First, the dog goes back to the shelter. Today. You've proven you can't afford the responsibility, and we're not subsidizing your impulsive decisions anymore." My heart stopped. "Dad, nobody's been through enough trauma. He's settled here, he's healthy, he trusts us. You can't just—" "Second," he continued, ignoring my protest, "you're going to withdraw from that ridiculous master's program and enroll in something practical. Business administration, maybe accounting, something that will actually lead to a career." "And third," Mom added, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold and final, "you're going to start acting like a member of this family instead of some kind of charity case with delusions of grandeur." I stared at them, these people who had raised me, fed me, housed me for 23 years, and realized I was looking at strangers. When had their love become so conditional? When had their approval become dependent on my ability to mirror their values perfectly? "I won't give up, Buddy," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I won't give up my dreams. This master's program is my future, Dad. It's what I want to do with my life." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom and Dad exchanged one of their wordless conversations, the kind married couples develop over decades together. Whatever they communicated in those glances, it didn't look good for me. "Elena," Mom said finally, "if you can't make adult decisions, then you can't live in our house as an adult. It's that simple." The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Give up everything that mattered to me, or lose my family and my home. I looked around the kitchen, where I'd eaten thousands of meals, done homework, celebrated birthdays, shared dreams and fears, and everything that makes up a childhood. The morning light streaming through the window my mother kept spotlessly clean, the coffee maker Dad had splurged on last Christmas, the refrigerator covered with Marcus's soccer schedules and family photos. "You're kicking me out," I said, not really a question. "We're giving you a choice," Dad corrected. "Make responsible decisions and stay, or continue down this path and find somewhere else to live. But we won't enable your poor choices anymore, and we won't let you continue embarrassing this family." I thought about my options. I had no savings left after paying for Buddy's medical bills. My part-time job at the vet clinic barely covered my personal expenses. My acceptance into the master's program came with a partial scholarship, but I'd need to take out loans for the rest, and that was assuming I could find somewhere to live with Buddy. But as I sat there, weighing the impossible choice between my family and my integrity, Buddy padded into the kitchen. He moved slowly, his arthritis worse in the mornings, but he came directly to me and rested his graying head on my knee. His brown eyes, still bright despite his age, looked up at me with complete trust. This dog had been abandoned once already by people who were supposed to love him. I couldn't do it again. "I need time to think," I said finally. "You have until tonight," Mom said, standing up and beginning to clear the breakfast dishes with sharp, angry movements. "Decide what kind of person you want to be, Elena. But decide somewhere else if you can't choose family." I spent that day walking through our neighborhood with Buddy, remembering every corner of my childhood. The playground where Marcus and I had spent countless afternoons. The corner store where we'd bought penny candy with allowance money. The park where Dad had taught us both to ride bikes, running behind us with his hand on our backs until we were steady enough to fly on our own. Everything looked the same, but felt different now. I was seeing it all through the lens of impending loss, marking each familiar sight as something I might never experience again as a daughter coming home. The weight of the choice ahead of me felt crushing, but with each step, with Buddy's steady presence beside me, something inside me was crystallizing into resolve. I loved my family. Despite everything, despite their conditions and ultimatums and inability to see me clearly, I loved them deeply. But I couldn't sacrifice my soul for their approval anymore. I couldn't abandon Buddy to a shelter system that would likely euthanize him within days. And I couldn't give up the dream that felt like the first authentic thing I'd ever discovered about myself. That evening, I packed my belongings into 3 garbage bags and a single suitcase. It didn't take long. Most of my life fit into containers I could carry. Mom watched from the doorway of my room, her face a mask I couldn't read. Sometimes I thought I saw regret flicker across her features, but it was always quickly replaced by something harder, more determined. "This doesn't have to be permanent," she said as I folded my last sweater. "You can come home anytime you're ready to be reasonable." I paused in my packing. Reasonable like giving up Buddy? Reasonable like abandoning my career goals? Reasonable like pretending to be someone I'm not so you don't have to feel embarrassed at dinner parties? Reasonable like thinking about someone other than yourself for once, she snapped, the mask slipping. "Do you think this is easy for us? Do you think we want to watch our daughter throw her life away? You're being selfish, Elena." Selfish and stubborn and naive. Maybe she was right. Maybe choosing an elderly dog and an uncertain career path over the security of family was the height of selfishness. But as I looked around my childhood room, at the walls covered with photos of animals I'd fostered, at the bookshelf filled with stories about people who chose compassion over convention, I knew I couldn't live any other way. Dad appeared in the doorway as I zipped up my suitcase. For a moment, I thought he might say something different, something that would bridge the gap that had opened between us. Instead, he handed me an envelope with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. "Your birth certificate and social security card," he said. "You'll need them for whatever comes next." The clinical practicality of it broke something inside me. He'd already accepted that I was leaving, had already started the process of severing official ties. I took the envelope, our fingers brushing briefly, and for just a second his composure cracked. I saw the father who had taught me to ride a bike, who had bandaged scraped knees and scared away monsters from under my bed. "Dad," I started, not sure what I wanted to say. "Make good choices, Mija," he said quietly, then turned and walked away. Marcus came home just as I was loading my bags into my beat-up Honda Civic. He took one look at the scene, me with tear-stained cheeks, Buddy sitting patiently by the car, our parents standing stiffly in the doorway, and his face crumpled. "You're really leaving?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. At 16, he was caught between childhood and adulthood, and I could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. "I have to," I said, pulling him into a hug that lasted too long and not nearly long enough. "But this isn't about you, Marcus. You're amazing, and I'm so proud of you. Don't let anyone tell you who you have to be, okay?" He nodded against my shoulder, and I felt his tears soaking through my shirt. "Will I see you again?" Of course I promised, though I had no idea how or when that might happen. This isn't goodbye forever. It's just goodbye for now. The final moment came faster than I expected. One minute I was standing in my driveway, surrounded by the only life I'd ever known, and the next I was sitting in my car with Buddy in the passenger seat, watching my childhood home recede in the rearview mirror. Mom and Dad stood in the doorway until I turned the corner, but they never waved. I drove aimlessly for hours that night, Buddy's steady breathing the only sound in the car besides the hum of the engine. I had nowhere to go, no plan beyond getting through the next few hours without falling apart completely. The reality of my situation was starting to sink in. I was homeless, nearly broke, and completely cut off from the only support system I'd ever known. Around midnight, I'd pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot and sat in the darkness, trying to figure out my next move. I had enough money for maybe a week in a cheap motel, assuming I could find one that allowed pets. After that, I had no idea what would happen. The master's program didn't start for another month, and even with the scholarship, I'd need a place to live and a way to support myself. I was scrolling through apartment listings on my phone, growing more discouraged with each impossible requirement and astronomical deposit, when a tap on my window nearly made me jump out of my skin. I looked up to see an elderly woman peering through the glass, concern etched across her weathered face. I rolled down the window cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Oh, honey," she said, her voice warm with an accent I couldn't place. "I've been watching you sitting here for the past hour, and you look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. Are you okay?" Something about her gentle manner, the genuine worry in her eyes, made my carefully constructed composure crumble. Before I knew it, I was crying again, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held decades of kindness, opened my car door and simply stood there, one weathered hand on my shoulder while I fell apart. There, she murmured. "Whatever it is, it's not the end of the world. I'm Rose, by the way. Rose Chen." Through my tears, I managed to introduce myself and explain, in halting phrases, what had happened. The ultimatum, the choice, the terrible loneliness of sitting in a parking lot at midnight with nowhere to go. Rose listened without judgment, occasionally making soft sounds of sympathy or understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. "Elena Rodriguez," she said finally. "I thought you looked familiar. You were at the dinner party last night, weren't you? At your parents' house?" I nodded, confused about why that mattered. Rose's expression shifted, becoming more determined. "I need to tell you something, dear. Something your parents don't know. I know, but something you deserve to hear." She glanced around the empty parking lot, then leaned closer to the car window. "That conversation last night, after you left the room, your mother said some things, painted you in a certain light. But I've been around long enough to recognize when someone is trying to convince themselves as much as their audience." I wiped my eyes, trying to focus on what she was telling me. "Your parents are scared, Elena. Scared that you're going to be hurt. Scared that you're making mistakes they can't protect you from. scared that you're choosing a path they don't understand. But underneath all that fear and frustration, I heard something else. "What?" I whispered. "Pride," she said firmly. "Buried deep, but it was there. Your father especially, when he was explaining your volunteer work to my husband, there was something in his voice. He's proud of your compassion, your dedication, your willingness to help others. He just doesn't know how to express it." The words should have been comforting, but they only made everything hurt more. If they're proud of me, why did they kick me out? Rose was quiet for another moment, her fingers drumming thoughtfully against the car door. "You know, I lost my daughter when she was about your age," she said finally. "Not to death, to stubbornness. Mine and hers. We had different ideas about what her life should look like, and instead of finding a way to bridge that gap, we both dug in our heels. By the time I realized that being right wasn't worth being alone, she was married to someone who wouldn't let her reconcile with me. I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "I spent 20 years regretting that pride, that need to be right. Don't let your parents make the same mistake, and don't you make it either. Give this some time, honey. Let the dust settle. Sometimes families need to be right. Break a little bit before they can heal stronger." She straightened up, then leaned down again. "In the meantime, you need a place to stay, don't you?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "My husband and I have a guest room above our garage. It's not much, but it's clean and warm, and it has its own entrance. You and your sweet dog are welcome to stay there while you figure things out." The kindness was overwhelming. "Mrs. Chen, I can't possibly—" "Rose," she corrected. "And you can't possibly what? Accept help from someone who wants to give it?" "Let me tell you something, Elena. Sometimes the family we're born into isn't the only family we get. Sometimes we have to build our own, piece by piece, from the people who see us clearly and choose to love what they see." And that's how I found myself, at 1 o'clock in the morning, following Rose Chen's taillights through winding suburban streets to a small house with a separate garage apartment that would become my refuge. Rose and her husband Harold, a retired teacher with gentle hands and a dry sense of humor, welcomed me and Buddy without question or judgment. The apartment was small but perfect. A studio space with a kitchenette, a full bathroom, and large windows that let in streams of morning light. Harold had set up a small bed for Buddy in the corner, complete with blankets and a water bowl. "We had a dog for 15 years, he explained simply. "I know what they need." That first night, as I lay in a strange bed listening to Buddy's gentle snoring and the unfamiliar sounds of a new neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not for reconciliation with my parents, not yet, but for the possibility that I could build a life that honored both my values and my need for connection. Rose Chen, it turned out, was more than just a kind stranger. Over the next few days, as I settled into my temporary home and tried to figure out my next steps, I learned that she had spent 40 years working as a social worker, specializing in family crisis intervention. She understood, better than almost anyone, the complex dynamics that could tear families apart, and the delicate work required to put them back together. "Your parents love you," she told me one morning as we shared coffee in her kitchen. Buddy contentedly sprawled at our feet. "They're just afraid that love isn't enough to protect you from the world." Sometimes parents make the mistake of thinking that controlling their children's choices is the same as caring for them. But they didn't even try to understand, I protested. They just demanded that I give up everything that matters to me. "Because they're scared," Rose repeated patiently. "Fear makes people say and do things that don't reflect their true hearts. Your mother especially. She's built her whole identity around what other people think. Having a daughter who doesn't care about those opinions threatens everything she believes about how the world works." It was during these conversations that Rose began to share stories about her own daughter Maria and the years they'd lost to stubborn pride and miscommunication. She painted a picture of a bright, passionate young woman who had wanted to be an artist, but whose parents had pushed her toward more practical pursuits. The fights, the ultimatums, the gradual erosion of trust and communication that had led to years of silence. "I thought I was protecting her," Rose said one afternoon as we walked Buddy around the neighborhood. I thought that if I just held firm, she'd eventually see reason and choose security over uncertainty. Instead, I lost her to someone who promised to support her dreams, even though he had no intention of keeping that promise. "Do you ever see her now?" I asked. Rose's smile was sad but peaceful. She died in a car accident 5 years ago. Harold and I found out from her obituary in the newspaper. We never got to meet our granddaughter, never got to apologize or explain or try to rebuild what we'd broken. The story hit me like a physical blow, both for Rose's pain and for what it might mean for my own situation. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry for me, honey. Be sorry for the years Maria and I lost because we were both too proud to say I was wrong. Learn from our mistakes. Don't let pride steal your family from you." But even as Rose urged patience and reconciliation, she was also supporting my immediate needs in ways that went far beyond providing shelter. She connected me with other social workers in her network, people who could offer advice about graduate school funding and career paths. She helped me find a part-time job at a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, a position that would provide both income and relevant experience for my future career. Most importantly, she helped me see that choosing my own path didn't make me selfish or ungrateful. "Standing up for your values is never easy," she told me, "but it's necessary. The trick is doing it with love instead of anger, with compassion instead of contempt." 3 weeks into my stay with the Chens, something unexpected happened. I came home from work to find Rose sitting at her kitchen table with a woman I didn't recognize, an elderly Latina with silver-streaked hair and hands that bore the calluses of decades of hard work. Both women looked up when I entered, and I saw something in their expressions that made my heart race. "Elena," Rose said carefully, "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is Esperanza Rodriguez, your grandmother." The world tilted on its axis. My grandmother? But that was impossible. Both of my grandmothers had died before I was born, or at least that's what my parents had always told me. I stared at this woman, searching her face for something familiar, something that would make sense of this impossible moment. Esperanza stood slowly, her movements careful but dignified, and took a step toward me. When she spoke, her voice carried the same slight accent I heard in my father's speech, when he was tired or emotional. "Mija," she said, and the endearment hit me like a thunderbolt. "I have been looking for you for so many years." The silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 23 years of lies. I stared at this woman who claimed to be my grandmother, searching her weathered face for some sign of deception, some indication that this was an elaborate mistake. But her eyes, dark brown flecked with gold, were unmistakably familiar. They were my father's eyes, and somehow looking into them felt like coming home to a place I'd never known existed. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "My grandmothers are both dead. My parents told me—" "Your parents told you many things that weren't true, mija," Esperanza said gently, her accent wrapping around the words like a warm embrace. "May I sit down? This is a long story, and these old bones don't stand as well as they used to." Rose gestured toward the kitchen table, and we all settled into chairs that suddenly felt too small for the enormity of what was happening. Buddy, sensing my distress, patted over and rested his head on my knee, his steady presence grounding me in a moment that felt completely surreal. Esperanza reached into a worn leather purse and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with photographs and documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and I noticed that her fingers bore the same long, elegant shape as my own. "I should start at the beginning," she said, spreading several photographs across Rose's kitchen table. "But perhaps it's better to start with why your parents told you I was dead." The first photograph she placed in front of me showed a young woman in a wedding dress, radiant with joy, standing beside a man in a military uniform. The woman had my father's eyes and my own stubborn chin, and despite the formal pose, there was something rebellious in her smile that I recognized from my own mirror. "That's me on my wedding day," Esperanza continued, 1962, just before your grandfather shipped out to Vietnam. We were so young, so full of dreams about the life we were going to build together." She touched the edge of the photograph tenderly. "Roberto was born 9 months later. while Miguel was overseas. I picked up the photograph with shaking hands. My father, as a baby, cradled in the arms of this woman who was supposed to be dead. The evidence was undeniable, but my mind struggled to process what it meant. "Your grandfather didn't come home from the war," Esperanza said quietly. Roberto was 3 when we got the news. I was 22, alone in a country where I barely spoke the language, with a little boy who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a small house with a carefully tended garden. I did what I had to do. I worked 3 jobs, learned English at night school, saved every penny so Roberto could have opportunities I never had. I wanted him to go to college, to become someone important, someone who would never have to scrub floors or clean other people's houses to survive. The pieces were starting to come together, painting a picture I didn't want to see. "Dad was ashamed of you," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Esperanza's smile was sad but not surprised. "Roberto wanted to fit in with his new family when he married your mother. Carmen came from a different world, a world where being the child of a war widow who cleaned houses for a living didn't match the image she wanted to project." Rose had been silent through this exchange, but now she leaned forward. "Esperanza came to me 6 months ago, Elena. She'd been trying to find you and your brother for years, but every attempt to contact your family was blocked. Your parents moved, changed phone numbers, did everything they could to erase her from your lives." "But why?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Why cut you off completely? Why lie about you being dead?" "Because I reminded them of things they wanted to forget," Esperanza said simply. "I reminded Roberto of where he came from, of the struggles he'd overcome. I reminded Carmen that her husband wasn't born into the middle-class respectability she prized so highly. And perhaps most importantly, I represented values that threatened their carefully constructed world." She pulled out more photographs, and my breath caught. These were recent pictures, taken from a distance but clearly showing our family. Me at my high school graduation, Marcus playing soccer, our parents at various social events. Someone had been watching us, documenting our lives from afar. "You've been following us," I said, and I couldn't keep the accusation out of my voice. "I've been loving you from a distance," Esperanza corrected. "Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy or sorrow, I've experienced it all through stolen glimpses and overheard conversations. Do you know how many times I've sat in the parking lot outside your school events, just hoping to catch a glimpse of my grandchildren growing up?" The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, and I felt something shift inside my chest. This woman had been grieving the loss of her family for decades, while I'd been grieving the absence of grandparents who were supposed to be dead. Rose stood up and moved to the kitchen counter, giving us space while still remaining close enough to provide support if needed. "Tell her about the letters, Esperanza," she said gently. My grandmother's expression became even more pained. "I wrote to you and Marcus every year on your birthdays, every Christmas, every time something important happened in my life that I wanted to share with you. Hundreds of letters over the years, all returned unopened with, returned to sender, stamped across the front." She reached into the envelope again and pulled out a thick stack of letters, all bearing my name in the same careful handwriting, all marked with various postal stamps indicating they'd been returned undelivered. The sight of them made my throat close up with emotion. "I saved them all," she continued, "hoping that someday, somehow, I'd have the chance to give them to you in person. They contain everything I wanted you to know about your family history, about the people you came from, about how proud I was of the young woman you were becoming." I picked up one of the letters, dated 3 years ago on my 20th birthday. The envelope was worn from handling, and I could see where tears had stained the paper. The weight of all those undelivered messages, all those years of enforced silence, felt crushing. "How did you find me?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Rose," Esperanza said simply. "After that dinner party, she called me. She'd heard your mother mention your full name, and she remembered seeing it in the volunteer records at the animal shelter, where she sometimes helps out. When she realized you might be the granddaughter I'd been searching for, she reached out." I looked at Rose with new understanding. Her kindness hadn't been random at all. She'd known exactly who I was when she found me crying in that parking lot. "You knew," I said to Rose. When you offered me the apartment, when you helped me with the job, you knew I was her granddaughter." Rose nodded. "I suspected, but I wasn't certain until I heard your full name and saw your reaction to what your parents had done. The way you chose that elderly dog over your family's approval, the way you stood up for your values despite the cost, it reminded me so much of the stories Esperanza had told me about herself as a young woman. I've been volunteering at the animal shelter for 15 years, Esperanza added. Every Saturday, without fail, Rose and I met there and became friends, and over time I told her about my lost family. She was the one who encouraged me to keep looking, to never give up hope. The connections were overwhelming. My grandmother had been volunteering at the same shelter where I'd rescued Buddy, where I'd spent countless hours learning about animal care and therapy techniques. We'd probably been in the same building dozens of times without knowing it. "That's not all," Rose said gently. "Esperanza, show her the other thing." My grandmother hesitated, then reached into the envelope one more time. What she pulled out made my heart stop completely. It was a legal document, official and stamped, but what caught my attention was the amount listed at the top, $150,000. "What is this?" I asked, though my hands were already shaking as I read the details. "It's a trust fund," Esperanza explained. "Money I've been saving for you and Marcus since you were born. Every extra dollar I earned, every sacrifice I made, it all went into accounts for my grandchildren's futures. I wanted to make sure you'd have opportunities, choices, the freedom to follow your dreams without worrying about money." I stared at the document, trying to process what I was seeing. This says the funds were supposed to be released when I turned 21. That was 2 years ago. "The trust required your parents' cooperation to access," Rose explained. "They had to acknowledge Esperanza's relationship to you and provide updated contact information. When they refused, the money remained locked away." "They knew about this," I said, understanding flooding through me. "They knew you were alive, they knew about the money, and they chose to keep it all from me." "I'm afraid so, mija," Esperanza said sadly. "I tried everything. Lawyers, mediators, even showing up at their house once. But they made it clear that they would fight any attempt I made to contact you or Marcus. They said it would only confuse you, that you were better off without me in your lives." The betrayal felt even deeper now. Not only had my parents lied about my grandmother's existence, they'd actively prevented me from accessing funds that could have changed my entire trajectory. The money I'd struggled to save for my apartment, the student loans I'd been dreading for graduate school, the financial stress that had driven so many of our family conflicts. All of it unnecessary. "There's more," Esperanza continued, and I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. "The money isn't just sitting in accounts earning interest. I've been investing it, growing it, preparing for the day when I could finally give it to you and Marcus. Your portion has grown to nearly $200,000. The number was staggering. $200,000 that could have eliminated my financial worries, could have given me the freedom to pursue my education and career without the constant stress of making ends meet. My parents had known about this money while I worked multiple jobs to afford my veterinary assistant training, while I'd given up my apartment fund to save Buddy, while they'd criticized my financial decisions and called me irresponsible. "I don't understand," I said, though understanding was exactly what was crystallizing in my mind. "Why would they keep this from me? It's not their money, it's not their choice to make." "Because it came from me," Esperanza said simply. "And accepting it would have meant acknowledging that I exist, that I'm part of your family, that their carefully constructed story about Roberto's background was built on lies." Rose stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the garden where Harold was working with patient concentration. "There's something else you need to know, Elena. Something that might help you understand your parents' actions, even if it doesn't excuse them." I braced myself for another revelation, wondering how many more shocks my system could absorb in one day. "Your father has been in contact with Esperanza," Rose said quietly. "Not directly, but through intermediaries. He's been getting updates about her health, her life, making sure she's okay. He's never stopped caring about her, Elena. He's just been too proud and too afraid to admit he made a mistake. This new information felt like a puzzle piece that changed the entire picture. Dad hadn't just callously abandoned his mother, he'd been monitoring her well-being from a distance while maintaining the fiction that she was dead. "How do you know this?" I asked. Esperanza pulled out one more document, this one a medical record from a hospital stay she'd had the previous year. In the emergency contact section, written in familiar handwriting, was my father's name and phone number. "I had a heart attack last summer," she explained. Roberto was the one they called. He came to the hospital, stayed with me for 3 days, made sure I had everything I needed. But he begged me not to tell you or Marcus. He said it would only complicate things, that you were better off believing I was gone. The image of my father sitting beside my grandmother's hospital bed, caring for her in secret while maintaining the lie to his children, was almost too painful to contemplate. It spoke to a level of compartmentalization and self-deception that I couldn't fully comprehend. "He loves you," I said to Esperanza, the truth of it evident in the evidence before me. "Yes," she agreed, "and he loves you and Marcus too. But he's trapped in a web of lies that he doesn't know how to escape from. Every year that passes makes it harder to tell the truth, harder to admit that he's been deceiving his children about something so fundamental." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of these revelations settling over us like a heavy blanket. Buddy shifted position, moving closer to me, and I absently stroked his graying fur while trying to process everything I'd learned. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," Rose said. "You have choices to make, Elena. About the money. About your relationship with your grandmother. About how you want to handle what you've learned about your parents." "I want to get to know you," I said to Esperanza, the words coming out with more certainty than I'd felt about anything in weeks. "I want to read those letters. Hear those stories. Learn about the family I never knew I had." Esperanza's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "I would like that very much, mija. I have so many things to tell you, so many years to catch up on." "But the money," I continued. "I don't know if I can accept it. Not when it would mean going behind my parents' backs, not when it would hurt them." "The money is yours by right," Rose said firmly. "Your grandmother saved it for you, invested it for you, intended it for you. Your parents have no legal claim to it, and more importantly, they have no moral right to keep it from you. Think about what you could do with that freedom," Esperanza added. "Your graduate program, your work with therapy animals, your dreams of helping people heal. This money could make all of that possible without the burden of debt or financial stress." I thought about my acceptance letter to the master's program, currently deferred because I couldn't figure out how to afford it. I thought about the veterans I'd met through my volunteer work, the ones who could benefit from animal-assisted therapy programs that didn't currently exist. I thought about Buddy and all the other elderly and special needs animals who could be saved if someone had the resources to care for them properly. "There's something else to consider," Rose said gently. "Your brother Marcus. He has the same right to know about his grandmother and his inheritance. Are you prepared to keep this secret from him the way your parents kept it from you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, who was still living at home, still dependent on our parents for everything from housing to college tuition. How could I burden him with this knowledge when he was in no position to act on it? "He's only 16, I protested, and he's not in the same situation I am. He hasn't been kicked out, hasn't had to choose between his family and his values." "Not yet," Esperanza said quietly. "But what happens when he does face that choice? What happens when your parents demand that he conform to their expectations the same way they demanded it from you? Wouldn't you want him to know he has other options, other support systems?" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Harold coming in through the back door, his gardening clothes dusted with soil and his hands dirty from working in the flower beds. He paused when he saw the documents spread across the kitchen table, the serious expressions on our faces. "How did it go?" he asked Rose, his voice gentle but concerned. "It went well," Rose replied. "Elena, Harold has been part of this search too. He's the one who helped Esperanza track down all the information about your family, who accompanied her to the lawyer's office to set up the trust documents. Harold washed his hands at the kitchen sink, then joined us at the table. Your grandmother is a remarkable woman, Elena. The sacrifices she's made, the persistence she's shown in trying to reconnect with her family. It's been an honor to help her in any way I could. I still don't understand how this all stayed hidden for so long, I said. Didn't anyone else in the family know? Didn't anyone think it was strange that my father's mother just disappeared from our lives? Esperanza and Harold exchanged glances, and I sensed there was more to the story. Roberto's extended family back in Texas knows I'm alive, Esperanza said carefully. Your tia Maria, your cousins, they've all been in contact with me over the years. But when Roberto asked them to respect his decision and not mention me to you and Marcus, they agreed. Family loyalty, even when it's misguided. I have an aunt? I asked, adding this to the growing list of relatives I'd never known existed. You have a whole family, Mija. Cousins your age, great aunts and great uncles who remember your grandfather, relatives who've been wondering about you and Marcus for years. Your tia Maria always said that someday the truth would come out, that family bonds are too strong to be broken forever. The idea of an entire extended family that I'd been cut off from was overwhelming. I thought about all the holidays we'd spent with just my parents and Marcus, all the times I'd wished for the warmth and chaos of a large family gathering. It had existed all along, just beyond my reach. They want to meet you, Harold added. When you're ready, when you feel prepared for it, there are a lot of people who would love to welcome you home. Home, I repeated, testing the word. I don't even know what that means anymore. Home is where people choose to love you, Rose said firmly. Sometimes that's the family you're born into. Sometimes it's the family you build for yourself. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have both. That evening, after Esperanza had returned to her own apartment with promises to call the next day, I sat alone in my studio space above the Chen's garage, surrounded by the unopened letters she'd left with me. 23 years of correspondence from a grandmother I'd never known existed, each envelope representing a birthday wish, a holiday greeting, a milestone celebration that had been marked in solitude. I opened the first letter, dated on my first birthday, written in Spanish, with an English translation attached. The handwriting was younger then, more confident, but the love in every word was unmistakable. Esperanza had written about her hopes for my future, her dreams of watching me grow up, her determination to be part of my life despite the obstacles my parents had created. As I worked my way through the letters chronologically, I began to see the evolution of my grandmother's feelings. Hope, gradually mixed with desperation, determination slowly tempered by heartbreak. By the time I reached the letters from my teenage years, the tone had shifted to one of resigned sadness, but the love never wavered. In a letter written on my 18th birthday, she'd included a photograph of herself holding a graduation cap and gown she'd bought in anticipation of my high school ceremony. She'd known she wouldn't be there to celebrate with me, but she'd marked the occasion anyway, alone in her apartment, holding symbols of an achievement she could only witness from afar. The final letter, written just 6 months ago on my 23rd birthday, was the most heartbreaking of all. In it, Esperanza had written about her fears that she might die without ever meeting her grandchildren, about the regrets that kept her awake at night, about the love that had never found its proper outlet. But there was also hope in that final letter, a sense that perhaps the tide was turning. She'd mentioned meeting Rose, their conversations about family reconciliation, her growing belief that truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it was buried. By the time I finished reading all the letters, it was nearly dawn. Buddy had fallen asleep beside me, his head resting on my lap, and the morning light was beginning to filter through the windows of my temporary home. I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely lighter, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had finally been lifted. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart skipped when I saw it was from Marcus. Elena, are you okay? Mom and Dad keep asking if I've heard from you, but they won't tell me what happened. I'm worried. I stared at the message for a long time, torn between my desire to protect my younger brother and my newfound commitment to honesty. How could I explain that everything we'd believed about our family was built on lies? How could I tell him about the grandmother he'd never known, the inheritance that could change his future, the complex web of love and deception that had shaped our entire lives? In the end, I typed back a simple response. I'm safe, and I'm figuring things out. Can we meet somewhere private this week? There are some things I need to tell you. His reply came immediately. Yes, whatever's going on, I want to help. The next few days passed in a blur of revelation and planning. Esperanza came to visit daily, bringing photo albums, family recipes, and stories that filled in the gaps of my personal history. I learned about my grandfather's service in Vietnam, about the young couple's dreams of building a life together in America, about the strength it had taken for a 22-year-old widow to raise a child alone in a foreign country. I also learned about my father's childhood, about the brilliant student who had worked his way through college on scholarships and determination, who had been the first in his family to achieve professional success. It painted a different picture of Dad, one that helped me understand his fierce drive for respectability and his fear of anything that might threaten the social standing he'd worked so hard to achieve. Rose and Harold became my informal advisors, helping me navigate the complex emotions and practical decisions that lay ahead. Rose, with her decades of experience in family counseling, helped me process the anger and grief I felt about the lost years. Harold, practical and steady, helped me understand the financial implications of the trust fund and the options available to me. You don't have to decide everything at once, Rose reminded me during one of our evening conversations. This is a process, Elena. Healing takes time, and rebuilding relationships, whether with your parents or your grandmother, can't be rushed. But I feel like I'm running out of time, I confessed. Esperanza is 78 years old. What if something happens to her before we can really get to know each other? What if my parents never come around, and I lose my chance to fix things with them too? Then you'll deal with those losses when and if they happen, Harold said gently. But you can't live your life based on what might go wrong in the future. You can only make the best decisions you can with the information you have right now. The meeting with Marcus took place at a small cafe near his school, neutral territory, where we could talk without the risk of our parents overhearing. I arrived early and chose a corner table, my stomach churning with anxiety about how he would react to what I was about to tell him. When Marcus walked in, I was struck by how much older he seemed than when I'd left home just a few weeks earlier. The carefree teenager I'd hugged goodbye had been replaced by someone more serious, more aware of the undercurrents that ran through our family. Elena, he said, sliding into the seat across from me. What the hell is going on? Mom cries every time someone mentions your name, Dad locks himself in his office for hours at a time, and everyone keeps saying you'll come to your senses, eventually. But nobody will tell me what happened. I took a deep breath, knowing that the next hour would change my brother's life as dramatically as mine had been changed. Marcus, what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to believe. But I need you to listen with an open mind, okay? For the next hour, I laid out everything. The ultimatum, my decision to leave, the discovery of our grandmother's existence, the trust fund, the decades of lies and hidden truths. Marcus listened without interruption, his expressions cycling through disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. Our grandmother is alive, he said when I finished, his voice flat with shock. She's been alive this whole time, and they told us she was dead. Not just alive, I said. She's been trying to contact us for years. She's been saving money for our futures, volunteering at the same animal shelter where I rescued Buddy, living just 30 minutes away from our house. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I want to meet her. I hoped you'd say that, I said, relief flooding through me. But Marcus, you need to understand what this means. If our parents find out, if they discover that you know the truth, things could get very complicated for you. They're already complicated, he said firmly. Elena, living in that house since you left has been horrible. They're both so angry, so defensive, so convinced that you're going to come crawling back apologizing for your mistakes. But I know you, and I know you wouldn't have chosen to leave unless something was really wrong." "What will you do?" I asked. "You're still dependent on them for everything. College, housing, support. I don't want my choices to hurt your future." Marcus leaned forward, his expression more mature than I'd ever seen it. "Elena, our parents lied to us about our grandmother for our entire lives. They kept us from knowing our own family, they denied us access to money that was legally ours, and they kicked you out for choosing compassion over convenience. Whatever consequences come from the truth, they brought them on themselves. That afternoon, I brought Marcus to meet Esperanza at Rose and Harold's house. The reunion was everything I could have hoped for and more. My grandmother took one look at Marcus and burst into tears, pulling him into a hug that seemed to encompass all the years they'd lost. "Mijo," she whispered, using the same endearment she'd used for me. "You look so much like your grandfather, so handsome, so strong. I have missed you every day of your life." Marcus, who rarely showed emotion, cried openly as he held his grandmother for the first time. "I can't believe they kept you from us," he said through his tears. "I can't believe we've missed so much time." "We haven't missed anything, mijo," Esperanza said firmly. "We're together now, and that's what matters. We have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." Over the following weeks, Marcus began spending every free moment he could at the Chen's house, getting to know Esperanza and learning about the family he'd never known existed. The change in him was remarkable. He seemed more grounded, more confident, more sure of his own identity and values. But this new arrangement couldn't last indefinitely. Our parents began to notice Marcus's frequent absences, his distracted behavior, his reluctance to discuss his activities. The tension in our childhood home grew thicker by the day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when Marcus was supposed to be at soccer practice but was instead at Rose's house, helping Esperanza bake traditional Mexican pastries for a family recipe exchange we'd planned. Mom called his coach looking for him when he didn't come home at the expected time, only to discover that practice had been canceled due to rain. Marcus came home to find both parents waiting in the living room, their expressions grim with suspicion and barely contained anger. "Where were you?" Mom demanded without preamble. "Coach Martinez said practice was canceled hours ago. You've been lying to us, Marcus. We want to know where you've been spending your time." I wasn't there for the confrontation, but Marcus called me immediately afterward, his voice shaking with adrenaline and fear. "Elena, they know something's up. They're threatening to take away my car, my phone, everything, unless I tell them what's going on. I don't know what to do." "Do you want to tell them the truth?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his tone. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'm tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of walking on eggshells around their secrets. If they want to know where I've been, I'll tell them. But Elena, I think you should be here when I do it. This affects you too, and I don't want to face this alone." That evening, for the first time since the night they'd kicked me out, I returned to my childhood home. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but walking through the front door felt like entering a foreign country. Everything was familiar yet wrong, like a photograph that had been subtly altered in ways that made it unsettling. Mom and Dad were waiting in the living room, the same positions they'd taken during our last confrontation. But this time, Marcus stood beside me, and I wasn't alone in facing their judgment and disapproval. "So," Dad said, his voice carefully controlled, "you've decided to come back." "I've decided to come for Marcus," I corrected. "He has something to tell you, and I'm here to support him." Marcus took a deep breath, his hand briefly touching mine for courage. "Mom, Dad, I know about Grandmother Esperanza. I know she's alive, I know about the money, and I know you've been lying to us our entire lives." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched our parents' faces cycle through shock, denial, anger, and finally a kind of defeated resignation. Mom's carefully maintained composure cracked first, her face crumpling as tears began to flow. "How?" she whispered. "How did you find out?" "Elena told me," Marcus said simply. "And then I met her myself. She's amazing, Mom. She's kind and funny, and she loves us so much it hurts. How could you keep her from us? How could you let us believe she was dead? Dad stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the neighborhood where he'd worked so hard to establish his place. You don't understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't know what it was like. Trying to build a life, trying to fit in, trying to give you children opportunities I never had. So you erased your mother from our lives? I asked, incredulous. You told us she was dead, rather than admit you came from humble beginnings? It wasn't supposed to be forever, Mom said, her voice breaking. We thought it would be easier at first. Less complicated. And then time passed, and it became impossible to explain. Impossible to take back. 23 years, Marcus said flatly. You maintained this lie for 23 years. You let your mother suffer alone while we grew up thinking we had no grandparents, no extended family, no history beyond what you chose to tell us. Dad turned back to face us, and I was shocked to see tears in his eyes. She was better off without us, he said quietly. I gave her nothing but heartache. I was ashamed of where I came from, ashamed of her struggles, ashamed of myself. I thought if I just cut ties completely, we could all move on, build new lives. But she never moved on, I said. She's been loving us from a distance, saving money for our futures, volunteering at the animal shelter, hoping to catch glimpses of her grandchildren. You didn't protect her by cutting her off, Dad. You just made her suffer in silence. The truth hung in the air between us, ugly and painful and impossible to ignore. For the first time in my life, I saw my parents not as authority figures or adversaries, but as flawed human beings who had made catastrophic mistakes out of fear and pride. What happened next would determine whether our family could find a way forward together, or whether the lies and hurt had created damage too deep to ever fully heal. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Mom wiped her eyes with shaking hands while Dad remained frozen by the window, his shoulders rigid with decades of buried guilt. Marcus and I stood together in the center of the room that had once felt like home, waiting for someone to say something that might begin to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Finally, it was Mom who spoke first. We need to call her, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to call Esperanza and apologize. God, Roberto, what have we done? Dad's laugh was bitter and hollow. What we've done? Carmen, we've destroyed our family. We've hurt everyone we claim to love in the name of protecting our image. And now our children know exactly who we really are. So what happens now? Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see him struggling to contain. Do we all just pretend this conversation never happened? Do you go back to lying, and we go back to pretending we believe you? I looked around the living room where I'd spent countless hours as a child, where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, where I'd done homework while Mom cooked dinner and Dad watched the news. The physical space was unchanged, but everything it represented felt irreparably broken. I want to see the letters, Mom said suddenly. The ones Esperanza wrote to you and Marcus. I want to know what she said, what we kept from you. Why? I asked, genuinely curious about her motivation. Because I need to understand the full scope of what we've done. I need to face it completely before I can figure out how to move forward. Dad finally turned from the window, his face aged by the weight of confession. Elena, Marcus, there's something else you need to know, something that might help you understand why this got so out of hand. I felt Marcus tense beside me. How many more revelations could one family contain? Your mother and I, Dad continued, his voice heavy with shame. We've been struggling financially for years. The business has been failing, the mortgage is underwater, and we've been living on credit cards and loans. When we found out about Esperanza's trust fund, He couldn't finish the sentence. You what? Marcus demanded, though I suspected we both already knew. We borrowed against it, Mom admitted, her face flushing with embarrassment. We found a way to use it as collateral for loans. We told ourselves it was temporary, that we'd pay it back before you ever needed to know. The betrayal cut even deeper than I'd imagined possible. Not only had they kept our inheritance from us, they'd actively stolen from it to fund their own financial mistakes. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 50,000 from each trust, Dad said quietly. Elena, Marcus, I know how this looks, but we were desperate. The business was going under, we were facing foreclosure, and we thought if we could just get through the rough patch. You stole from your own children, Marcus said, his voice flat with disbelief. You lied about our grandmother being dead, and then you stole the money she saved for us. We were going to pay it back, Mom insisted, but her words sounded hollow even to her. I thought about all the times they'd criticized my financial decisions, all the lectures about responsibility and planning for the future. They'd been stealing from my inheritance while telling me I was wasteful for rescuing an elderly dog. Where does this leave us? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. What happens to our family now? For a long moment, nobody answered. The weight of decades of deception hung over us like a toxic cloud, poisoning even the possibility of honest communication. Then Dad surprised me. He walked to his desk, pulled out a checkbook, and began writing. This doesn't fix anything, he said, tearing off the check and handing it to me. But it's a start. This covers what we took from your trust, plus interest. I looked at the check, made out for $65,000. It represented a significant portion of their remaining assets, money they probably couldn't afford to give away given their financial situation. Dad, I can't take this, I said, trying to hand it back. If you're already struggling financially, take it, he said firmly. It was never ours to begin with. Elena, I've made more mistakes than I know how to count, but keeping your money from you won't be one of them anymore. Mom stood up abruptly, startling all of us. I need to see her, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. I need to see Esperanza and apologize face to face. Roberto, we owe her that much. She might not want to see us, Dad said quietly. After everything we've done, she has every right to refuse. Then we'll accept that, Mom replied. But we have to try. We have to at least try to make this right. The conversation that followed was painful and honest in ways our family had never experienced before. For the first time in my memory, my parents talked openly about their fears, their mistakes, their regrets. They acknowledged the damage they'd done not just to Esperanza but to Marcus and me, to the trust and love that should have been the foundation of our relationships. It was nearly midnight when we finally worked out a plan. Mom and Dad would accompany Marcus and me to meet with Esperanza, not to ask for forgiveness necessarily, but to acknowledge the harm they'd caused, and to begin the slow process of rebuilding what had been broken. The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday at Rose and Harold's house, neutral territory, where everyone might feel safe enough to be vulnerable. I spent the week leading up to it in a state of anxious anticipation, alternating between hope that my family might find a way to heal and terror that the confrontation would only cause more damage. Esperanza was nervous too. When I visited her the day before the meeting, she was pacing around Rose's kitchen, her hands fluttering as she tried to articulate her fears. What if they're only doing this because they feel guilty? She asked. What if they apologize and then disappear again? I don't think my heart could survive losing Roberto twice. Then you'll know you tried, Rose said gently. Esperanza, you've carried this pain for 23 years. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least you'll have answers. At least you'll know you did everything you could. Sunday arrived gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood of the occasion. I arrived at Rose's house early to find Esperanza already there, dressed in her best outfit and clutching a manila envelope that I knew contained photographs and mementos she'd been saving for decades. Marcus came next, looking older than his 16 years, followed shortly by our parents. Mom had clearly been crying, her makeup carefully reapplied but not quite able to disguise the puffiness around her eyes. Dad's face was set in the careful mask he wore when preparing for difficult business negotiations, but I could see the fear underneath. The first few minutes were excruciating. Esperanza and my father faced each other across Rose's living room, 23 years of separation and hurt stretching between them like an ocean. Neither seemed to know how to begin bridging that distance. Then Esperanza spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Roberto, mijo, you look so tired." Those simple words, spoken with such tenderness and concern, broke something open in my father. His carefully maintained composure crumbled, and he began to cry with the raw abandon of a child. "Mama," he sobbed, using a word I'd never heard him say before. "Mama, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Esperanza crossed the room in quick steps despite her age, pulling her son into her arms the way she probably had when he was small and frightened. "Shh, Mijo. It's okay. You're here now. That's what matters." The reunion between my father and grandmother was beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. Years of accumulated pain and love poured out in Spanish and English, in tears and embraces, in whispered apologies, and fierce declarations of family loyalty. Mom hung back at first, clearly uncertain of her place in this reunion. But Esperanza, with the intuitive wisdom of a woman who had raised children and survived decades of heartbreak, reached out to include her. "Carmen," she said warmly, "come here, Mija. You are part of this family too." What followed was the most honest conversation our family had ever had. Esperanza shared her pain at being cut off from her grandchildren, but she also listened as Mom and Dad explained their fears and insecurities. She didn't excuse their behavior, but she tried to understand it, offering the kind of grace that only comes from deep love and hard-won wisdom. Marcus was quiet through most of the conversation, absorbing the family dynamics that were being laid bare for the first time. When Esperanza turned to him with questions about his interests, his dreams, his thoughts about the future, he opened up in ways I'd rarely seen. "I want to study engineering," he told her, "but I also want to learn Spanish, learn about our family history. I feel like there's this whole part of myself that I never knew existed." "We have engineers in the family," Esperanza said proudly. "Your cousin Miguel, he designs bridges. And your tia Maria, she's been teaching Spanish literature for 30 years. You have so much family to discover, mijo." As the afternoon wore on, something shifted in the room. The terrible tension began to ease, replaced by something that felt tentative but real. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning of understanding that family bonds, even when damaged, can sometimes be stronger than the forces that try to break them. Dad pulled out his phone at one point and made a call that surprised everyone. "Maria?" he said, his voice uncertain. "It's Roberto. I know it's been a long time, but I was wondering if you might want to meet your niece and nephew." The conversation that followed was emotional and brief, but it ended with plans for a larger family reunion the following month. Marcus and I would finally meet the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been wondering about us for years. As the day drew to a close, practical matters had to die away. Be addressed. Esperanza insisted on transferring our trust funds immediately, despite Dad's protestations that we should wait until we were more established in our lives. "I'm 78 years old," she said firmly. "I've waited 23 years to give this money to my grandchildren. I'm not waiting another day." The paperwork was complex, but Harold had prepared most of it in advance. By evening, Marcus and I each had access to nearly $200,000. Money that would eliminate our financial worries and give us the freedom to pursue our dreams without compromise. For Marcus, it meant college without student loans, the opportunity to study abroad, the security of knowing he could take risks and follow his passions. For me, it meant graduate school, the ability to start my animal therapy practice, and the resources to help other rescue animals like Buddy. But more than the money, we had gained something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge of where we came from, the connection to a history and culture that had been kept from us, and the understanding that family love, even when imperfect, can survive almost anything. The healing process wasn't immediate or easy. There were still difficult conversations to be had, trust to be rebuilt, new relationship dynamics to navigate. Mom and Dad had to face their financial situation honestly, accepting help from Esperanza and other family members while learning to live more modestly. But there were also moments of pure joy. The first family dinner, where 4 generations sat around the same table. The afternoon when Esperanza taught me to make my grandfather's favorite recipes while telling stories about their courtship. The evening when Marcus proudly showed off his improving Spanish to our Tia Maria via video call. 6 months later, I was accepted into my graduate program with a full scholarship and a research assistantship studying animal-assisted therapy. My work with veterans and trauma survivors was gaining recognition, and I had plans to open a nonprofit clinic after graduation. Marcus thrived with the knowledge of his extended family and the financial security to pursue his dreams. He spent the summer in Mexico with our relatives, immersing himself in the language and culture he'd been denied, returning home confident and bilingual. Mom and Dad were working on themselves too, attending counseling both individually and as a couple. They were slowly rebuilding their finances. And, more importantly, learning to base their self-worth on their actual values, rather than their perceived social status. The most surprising development was the friendship that blossomed between Mom and Esperanza. What had started as awkward apologies grew into genuine affection, as they discovered shared interests and complementary strengths. Mom's organizational skills proved invaluable in helping Esperanza navigate Medicare and Social Security, while Esperanza's wisdom and life experience helped Mom gain perspective on what really mattered. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment near campus with Buddy contentedly sleeping at my feet, I reflected on how much had changed since that night when I'd been kicked out for being embarrassing. I'd lost the family I thought I had, but I'd gained the family I'd actually always needed. Rose and Harold had become like additional grandparents, their guest apartment having served as a bridge between my old life and my new one. Their kindness to a stranger in a parking lot had set in motion a chain of events that transformed multiple lives. The relationship with my parents was different now, built on honesty rather than performance. We still disagreed sometimes, still had to navigate the lingering effects of years of miscommunication. But there was respect now, understanding, and most importantly, unconditional love. Esperanza had become the anchor I'd never known I needed. A source of wisdom and unconditional support that gave me the confidence to pursue my dreams without fear. Her stories of resilience and determination inspired me to take risks, to trust my instincts, to believe that love and purpose mattered more than security or approval. Marcus visited often, full of plans for his future, and excited about the possibilities that had opened up for him. We talked about our childhood differently now, understanding the context that had shaped our parents' choices while still holding them accountable for the damage those choices had caused. The final piece of healing came a year later. At Marcus's high school graduation, the entire extended family came to celebrate, filling an entire section of the auditorium with aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had traveled from across the country to witness this milestone. As Marcus walked across the stage to receive his diploma, I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Esperanza, tears of pride streaming down her weathered cheeks. Mom and Dad, holding hands and beaming with genuine joy. Rose and Harold, who had insisted on being included in this family celebration. Tia Maria and her children, who were planning to host Marcus for another summer in Mexico. This was what family was supposed to look like. Complicated, imperfect, sometimes messy, but ultimately held together by love and commitment to each other's well-being. It had taken a crisis to teach us this lesson, but we had learned it well. After the ceremony, as we gathered for dinner at a restaurant large enough to accommodate our extended family, Esperanza raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded table. "To the courage to tell the truth, even when it's difficult. To forgiveness, to growth, and to the understanding that love is always worth fighting for." As we clinked glasses and shared stories and laughter, I realized that being kicked out for being embarrassing had been the best thing that ever happened to me. It had forced me to discover who I really was, what I truly valued, and what family actually meant. Sometimes the most devastating moments in our lives are actually doorways to something better. Sometimes being rejected for who you are leads you to people who celebrate exactly that person. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to choose authenticity over acceptance, you discover that the love you've been searching for was there all along, just waiting for you to be ready to receive it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.